Okay, so a very good evening to everyone today. I'm Salila Vanka and I teach at RV College of Architecture, Bangalore, of course. And with 30 years of in the field of architectural education, RVCA continues to evolve and grow as one of the leading institutions in its field. Today's webinar, A Meaningful Architecture for All, from the consumptive to the experiential, reflects the core values of RVCA's new forthcoming journal, Subversion, which is due for publication in late 2022. It's a collaboration of the college and the editorial team of RVCA and guest editor Iyer, a writer, researcher, and founder of the Bangalore-based Native Place. Subversion's first edition is titled Bangalore as Palimpsest, and it seeks to foster interdisciplinary reflections and dialogues on space, place, and time pertaining to Bangalore. Today's panel discussion is our initiative to engage subject experts and our audience in conversations about cultural spaces in the public domain in Bangalore. With this very brief introduction, now I invite our principal, Dr. O.P. Bhavne, to address the audience. Thanks.
Dr. Salila, this is Om Prakash Bhavne, principal of RV College of Architecture, and it is my pleasure and honor to welcome such a distinguished panel today, comprising of Dr. Rajeev Gowda, who doesn't need any introduction because we have often seen him on TV, say many time on debate, many time when the Rajya Sabha TV is switched on, we have seen him debating on very useful topics. Then we have the Dr. Architect Edgar Demello, Dr. Meera Iyer, Ms. Pushpamala, Architect Bijoy Ramachandran, and Mrs. Champaka. On behalf of my college, my students and the faculty and the management, I extend a very warm welcome to each one of you. It is really pleasure and pride to have such a distinguished panel amongst us today. RV has always been always tried to engage in this kind of academic discussions and debate, having eminent people from the field of academics and other allied areas, which merge well with the discipline of architecture. Dr. Salila has given the background, a brief background of why this particular panel discussion has been arranged and organized. We have been talking about organizing this particular discussion for a long time because it goes with the theme of the first research journal which we are bringing out. Editorial team has been putting best of their efforts. And this particular journal, the first issue, is all about the city of Bangalore. Okay. So I think that the discussion is also actually will revolve around what is happening, what is going around as far as the architectural discipline is concerned, and how the cultural spaces are shaping the public life. And the topic of the discussion, as I can see, worked out by my team, is a meaningful architecture, and there is a question mark. Means I always thought that the architecture is always meaningful, but I think now there is a question mark. So I think that let us learn from our distinguished panel that yes, that today's architecture is really meaningful or not. So without taking much time of the panel, I think we should initiate the discussion. And over to you, Salila.
Thank you, sir. Now I will invite my colleague Madhuri Rao to introduce the speakers and take the evening forward. Thanks.
Good evening, one and all. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists, and would like to start with Bijoy Ramachandran. Architect and urban designer Bijoy is the co-founding partner with Sonita Kundur at Hundredhands, a multidisciplinary design studio based in Bangalore and established in 2003, having worked on a wide variety of projects ranging from cafe interiors to apartment buildings and institutions. The studio's design approach is rooted in focusing on the urban context through the medium of scale, character, spatial and visual impact, and most importantly, the remaking of the public domain. Hundredhands has won multiple awards, which include the Indian Institute of Architects National Award, an official selection for the Project South exhibition, and the Leon di Pietra at the Venice Biennale, and the Cityscape Architectural Review Award. Bijoy was a panelist at the annual All India Undergraduate Thesis Review, the Kurla Varke Foundation Design Forum, at CEPT, Ahmedabad, in 2006 and 2014. He currently serves as the postgraduate design chair at BMS College of Architecture, Bangalore. Bijoy has a bachelor's degree in architecture from BMS College, Bangalore University, a master's degree from MIT Cambridge, USA, in architecture and urbanism, and has attended the Glenmarket Masterclass. Our second panelist for the day, Champaka Rajagopal, is an urbanist who works in the unsettled space between practice and research. She has a degree in architecture from CEPT Ahmedabad, a master's degree in urban design from the University of California at Berkeley, and a PhD in planning and international development studies from the University of Amsterdam.
No, it is not connected. Off the switch, sir.
Muted.
I'm sorry. Champaka is an independent practitioner, researcher, and educator, and presently a visiting faculty at Azim Premji University at Bangalore and CEPT University, Ahmedabad. Our third panelist for the day, Meera Iyer, is a writer and researcher with an interest in history, heritage, and culture. She is the author of the book Discovering Bangalore. Her writing has been published in Seminar, The Hindu, Deccan Herald, Heritage India, and other publications. She co-wrote the dossier to have Hoysala temples inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. She is the convener of INTACH Bengaluru chapter, and she also has a PhD in forest ecology. Our fourth panelist for the day, Pushpamala N, has been called the most entertaining artist iconoclast of contemporary Indian art. In her sharp and witty work as a photo and video performance artist, sculptor, writer, curator, and provocateur, and in her collaboration with writers, theater directors, and filmmakers, she seeks to subvert the dominant discourse. She is known for her strong feminist work and for her rejection of authenticity and embracing of multiple realities. As one of the pioneers of conceptual art in India and a leading figure in the feminist experiments in subject, material, language, her inventive work has a deep influence on art practice in India. Our fifth panelist for the day, Professor M.V. Rajeev Gowda, was an Indian Member of Parliament from 2014 to 20. He represented Karnataka state and the Indian National Congress Party in the upper house, the Rajya Sabha. He is chairman of the Congress Party's research department, was convener of its manifesto committee for the 2019 election, and is also a national spokesperson. Earlier, he was Professor of Economics and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, IIM Bangalore, where he also served as chairperson, Center for Public Policy. He has been a director on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India and a Carnegie Council Global Ethics Fellow. He most recently co-edited a book that is India's Risk, Oxford University Press. He has a BA from St. Joseph's College, Bangalore, an MA in Economics from Fordham University, and a PhD in Public Policy and Management from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He has also been a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma. Professor Gowda founded the Resurgent India Trust, has mentored startup companies, and works on youth empowerment, among other areas of interest. An avid quizzer, Professor Gowda was founder secretary of the Karnataka Quiz Association in 1983 and national runner-up on BBC TV's Mastermind India in 2002. Last last but not the least, I'd like to introduce RV's very own dear Edgar Demello, who has kindly agreed to be a moderator for this event. And he specifically told me to introduce him as an architect, teacher, curator, traveler, writer, and old Bangalorean. And he ended it with an ashte. So thank you, Edgar. Thank you so much for doing this for us. And we look forward to all the provocations that you're going to throw at this amazing panel. I also like to take a moment to discuss the format of this event very briefly. So before I hand over the session to Edgar, the premise, Edgar would present the premise of the discussion, followed by a 5-minute presentation by each of the panelists, after which we have questions for the panel and followed by audience questions. So without taking up more time, Edgar, over to you.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the cliche. You know, I'm sort of humbled to be a moderator for this incredibly diverse panel. Just listening to their achievements has been sort of an education of sorts. So first of all, of course, I've got to thank all 5 of you for agreeing to participate, because that's what made it such a interesting and diverse panel. Architects, strategists, artists, curator, writer, conservator, academic. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you know, public figure as well, Professor Gowda. It's a sort of dream team, I think the Americans would call it. And a special thank you to Rajeev, because he has just returned from Hyderabad. He's been on the road like apparently forever. So now we've already blown 2 stereotypes, you know, today. One is there are only 2 architects on this panel, and I think that's wonderful. And the second, of course, one can see, you know, the very interesting composition of the panel. The ratio of 2:3. Anyway, so now let's get going, and hopefully we'll be breaking new ground. For the audience, I will briefly introduce the premise. Allow me to be a bit dramatic, especially when Professor Dr. Bhavne talked about the meaningfulness in architecture. A meaningful architecture for all. A meaningful architecture for all. A meaningful architecture for all. So it's the power of the punctuation mark, and I think the word important here is all. So world as we know it is changing in front of our eyes, physically and metaphorically. The old binaries have been reloaded. Dystopia rules worldwide. The predictable cyclic pattern of the seasons have given way to climate change, political instability, a resurgent pandemic, and once again, war. Narrow nationalism has replaced the heterogeneous and dynamic texture of our cities. Fear, anxiety, and insecurity, caused also by the pandemic, are the new emotions amongst the populace, not to speak of the mental health issues they lead to. Issues not often spoken of. It seems like a scenario scripted by Mr. Kafka himself. But history has shown us that each time the planet was overtaken by crises, humankind has reimagined and reinvented ways to reconstruct a new socio-cultural reality or order, be it in the fields of science and technology, medicine, the social sciences, and correspondingly in the fields of the humanities, art, and architecture. Architecture positioning itself as a go-between to bring together the best of both worlds. But more than a go-between, architecture has a tremendous responsibility. It must now reflect upon the new reality, perhaps through a tabula rasa, to invoke fresh, exciting, and equitable spatial dimensions for the well-being of all its users. Buildings should now be designed, at least in part, for all, and not just for a few. Yes, it's time for a new architectural language based on people, plurality, and participation. Shifting into the realm of literature, there is an apt analogy in Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. He writes, Graphomania, or the mania for writing books, inevitably takes on epidemic proportions when a society develops to a point of creating three basic conditions. One, an elevated level of well-being, which allows people to devote themselves to useless activities. Two, a high degree of social atomization, and as a consequence, a general isolation of individuals. And three, the absence of dramatic social changes in the nation's internal life. This book was first published in 1978, so it's over 50 years, in Czech. Whilst a third might be contentious, given the enormous polarities introduced into the socio-economic fabric, the first to have infected the upwardly mobile middle classes. It's only through the onset of the pandemic that the elevated level of well-being that Kundera refers to showed signs of collapse. But when one compares graphomania with archimania, an unreadable book collects dust on a shelf, unnoticed. A bad building in full view, not just dust, but also mold on the user's metaphysical well-being, on their psyche. Taking a leaf from Mr. Kundera's book, the idea is to generate a discussion on how to tackle the pre-pandemic euphoria, archimania, if you will, of more and more big, fat, and ugly buildings and building types that have only magnified our social sins of greed and self-centeredness, and reframe the whole narrative with meaningful, thought-provoking, and sustainable buildings. Buildings that see a connectedness between resources, ideas, utility, and should I dare say, magic. For this discussion, we will be referring to buildings for culture, because there is no better way to bring people together than through a shared platform for folk, popular, classic, and importantly, experimental cultural exchanges. Our own cities have shown a very strong resilience in times of crisis, in part because, in principle, we are a culture of the outdoors. The streets and their thresholds, free platforms, courts, verandas, and parks for all. In the same vein, we now need a toolkit of building types that have a more participatory nature so that the extremes that exist in our cities are somehow mitigated. The city, with its cultural largesse, must belong to all. There are already early signs of this in our city, with the various hubbas and neighborhood cultural centers organized and funded by private initiatives. These are pockets of reprieve that must come into the public domain, non-elitist and easy to navigate for all. The scale on which such a change must take place surely needs serious government intervention with an imaginative cultural policy. Francois Mitterrand comes to mind in Paris of the late 60s and the 70s. A complete existential overhaul, a radical paradigm shift must be in the making for through private and public partnership for us all to experience this new relationship to public space. The unique cosmopolitan quality of Bangalore's demography and that of the country needs to be celebrated for what it is, diverse and inclusive. And architecture must become the enabler. But it's obvious that this is a role that needs more players than just architects. Architecture is, after all, a profession that is always needed to interface with and be nurtured by other disciplines. Importantly, it would reframe the relationship with people, between people, culture, and place. Thank you. I think the most oft repeated word in this thing that I've just spoken is the word all, A-double-L. I think it might have been featured about 25 times. So I think what one is really trying to impress upon ourselves is all inclusive. That's the way forward. So I think Madhuri or Salila have already spoken about the structure. So now I have read out the premise, and now each of the five will do a sort of response or make a presentation on what they feel really is their take or their notions on the constructing of cultural space within the city. So now I don't know who will want to go first, but I had thought perhaps Bijoy, and then maybe Rajeev, and then Meera, Pushpa, and then Champaka. But of course, you all can change it. Bijoy?
Thanks, Edgar, and thanks, Salila and Madhuri and Professor Bhavne for inviting me. Thanks, Edgar, for including me on this wonderful panel with the others. I've actually put together a very small, very short presentation. This is primarily on the BIC. It's just a few slides and about what makes that for me a valuable experience from our own practice as a way that one negotiates with the city in a way to make something of meaning. So I'll just share my screen and then we can go from there. Is it visible?
Yes. It's not a full screen. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to read, so please forgive me. But in 2012, David Chipperfield curated the Venice Biennale, and the theme was Common Ground, and the exhibition was predicated on the idea that good architecture doesn't happen naturally. It requires a conspiracy of circumstances and participants. Like in Cyrus Kabiru's wonderful photographs at the Kochi Biennale, we architects need to learn to see the world in different ways. Our work a reflection of empathy and creative assimilation. Louis Cantu, as shown in these drawings of the Dominican Mother House, had to understand his clients, their budgets, and internalize the spiritual ambitions of the order to come to a plan which signified, unlike his first scheme on the extreme left, the inseparability of the private life of the sisters from their public responsibilities. Mashing up these different spaces into a plan of incredible vitality on the extreme right. The reduced footprint then meant the sisters had to pay less money as well because they had a very limited budget. But this assimilation of the program and the higher ideals of the order influenced Khan, and that dialogue with the Dominican sisters influenced this project fundamentally. And so it is in a way a shared sense of authorship. This is the BIC, a small public building, won in a competition which took an interminable 7 years to do and required the active involvement of the BIC membership, 27 different project architects, 11 consultants, 17 contractors, 18 distinct iterations, and all for a very small building of 45,000 square feet. I would like to submit the BIC as a valid precedent for the constructive coming together of many people. The project shows the positive results of this long, intimate, positive working environment. The facility has become an active cultural hub in the city, appropriated in wonderful ways by the BIC and the larger community. There is a sense that the building is a real representation of a shared ideal and communal authorship. We must move away from the seductive notion of the creation of architecture and of public space as a form of immaculate conception and celebrate it as a result of negotiation and reflection in action, a form of shared authorship and the outcome of genius. So here are some pictures of the BIC. But really, I mean, we share with the BIC building committee, with all of our consultants, the people who worked in our office, etc., that the meaning of the project comes through those negotiations and discussions with people. And it's nice that the BIC now has again found the people back in it. throbbing with life, with activity. And it is once again, what we missed a lot, this kind of meeting place for the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Bijoy.
Shall I go ahead?
Rajeev, yes.
Yeah. So my perspective is not that of an architect per se, but of a policymaker, someone who is also, a Mandina Maga, a citizen of this city. And so for me, when you talk about the architecture of Bangalore, there are many architectures. There's even a built architecture. There's a natural architecture, which over the years we've substantially destroyed and manipulated in very negative ways. But the whole idea is that we've got, so much potential as a city. When you talked about when you talked about cosmopolitan, this is a city that has the potential to literally showcase so many diverse cultures, including the local native cultures. And actually what has happened over the years is that we haven't actually done that. If you look at the way the city has emerged, the way the cities, the newer built spaces are substantially on the outskirts. The IT sector are mostly closed spaces, secured and inaccessible to anyone other than those who work there, right? So you look at them from the outside, but you don't get to engage. Contrast that to what happens in the center of the city. On say, if you can think about a festival that we may all have participated in, Chitra Sante. Chitra Sante, once a year, the area around the golf course in Kumarakupa Road is closed off. It's opened up to artists. It becomes a street fair, and it just transforms people's engagement, with art and artists, and makes art become so much more accessible and allows more people to take part in it. Now, that's one dimension. When you see Church Street as a new example of urban design in action, you see on the weekends that again, it becomes a space for that comes alive with, again, with various kinds of artists, with others who have not yet, there's so much more that's possible out there. And behind, these are the visible, engaged, accessible spaces to all of us in some ways. But along with that, there are many other kinds of, there's a whole spectrum of architecture that we either engage with or don't. Something like UB City, strangely enough, which is supposed to be a high-end mall, is actually accessible to large numbers of people because it doesn't stop anybody from going in there and wandering around and even possibly window shopping. But at the same, there's a whole part of Bangalore that a lot of people have never engaged with, and that is the villages around which the city has grown, the lakes which have often been abused over the years and are slowly being saved and revived and turned into, potentially cultural spaces of one sort or the other. But when I talk about Chitra Sante, when I talk about, if you actually go to the villages around which the city has grown, right? I live in Baswangudi, there's Mavali, there's Siddhapura, there's so many other places just right around, and we drive past and we see sometimes that there is a village festival on. And these, you will see the bright lights, you'll see music, but actually, you need to get off the main road and into the by lanes, and then you'll discover that there are, temples and processions and festivals, and the best and biggest example, of course, is the Karaga, right? And one of the challenges for the city is that we are a fairly young city, a few hundred years old, and we've not really engaged with the heritage architecture that we have, right? And it's not showcased. It's people come to Bangalore as tourists more to go to Mysore rather than to engage with what we already have, right? So in that sense, there is just so much more potential, so much more that we need to do. And a lot of this would require us to open our minds to different kinds of different kinds of cultural expression. There's a tendency on the political class's part, on the part of the police and others, to try and curb these possibilities. For example, when I was, in college, there used to be rock concerts in Cubbon Park. That's a long forgotten possibility. And it's something that could easily be revived and give more and more people an opportunity to come and participate. So instead, we've come up with an architectural idiom of parks for older people to walk in, and not necessarily using or creating enough spaces for art, theater, dance, the kind of things that we do indoors mainly, but which Bangalore and its salubrious climate would allow us to do amazingly well outdoors as well. And so as we go forward, what I would say is that we need to think about inclusivity in the form of different kinds of cultural expressions, different kinds of festivals, different kinds of people and languages, and think about the architecture of the city and how to evolve it in a sort of with an open, inclusive mindset, which then finds a way to create platforms. The Ashwath Kate in an old village is a platform, and there are numerous such platforms that we can create for people to come together, for children to discover their talents, and some of this could be for even other dimensions, sports as a culture, these sorts of things. And but we have instead moved towards the sterility of the IT park and the the apartment complexes on the outskirts. And those are areas also where, at least around the lakes that are still there, there's probably a lot that can be done to create spaces for cultural revival and engagement. And so when I think about my perspective, it is, how do we make this all come alive? Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rajeev. You've brought in another dimension, I think, to the discourse here. Two important things you said. One, the openness and the spontaneous as against the formal and the organized. And I think that's a very important, sort of cultural, counterpoint where one needs to articulate exactly where the role of architecture comes in. Because I mean, when I talk about architecture and meaning and all, we are actually going across the whole populace, from Baswangudi to Malleshwaram to Koramangala to wherever. But the idea is that the fact that Bijoy talked about his building in Bengaluru, I will put it in the provocations, is that sort of blueprint something that can go across the city in a formalized way, because there will always be the spontaneous, and that's cyclic. I think the festivals are cyclic. They come and they repeat, and the preparations are wonderful, and it's just full of energy. I think that versus the things that are perhaps staged and formal. So I think there's a sort of a tension, I think, between one and the other, which I think is a very interesting starting point. So, Meera.
Just a minute. Yeah, hi, Edgar, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this very, very, very august panel. So I will take off from where both you, Edgar, and what Rajeev also spoke about. Rajeev spoke about how spaces are, many of these spaces for culture tend to be outside the city, but I'd like to focus on built spaces which are already, which are public spaces within the city, which also have the potential to be cultural spaces. So the first thing that comes to mind, and you've mentioned this in your introduction as well, is of course the streets. And Rajeev talked about the Karaga. I remember how, some years ago when I went to see the Karaga, I remember seeing on SJP Park Road, these men at 9:30 at night sitting and cooking on the streets. And then the next morning when you go, it's completely full of traffic again. So this kind of this transformation that happens on the streets is something that I think is, you see it in other parts of the city as well, where Avenue Road becomes full of flowers every morning. The region around KR Market as well becomes a sea of flowers every morning. And then, later when you go, it's completely full of traffic once again. So these spaces that lend themselves to multiple uses are, I think, characteristic of many cities, and Bangalore is no exception. But if you extend from the cities, we also have a lot of other spaces around the city, which are public spaces, which can be adapted for use as cultural spaces. So for example, there are more than a dozen, maybe around 15 to 18 smaller markets around the city. So you mentioned Mavali. There's Mavali, there's Kabanpet, there's Moor Market, Margadi Road Market, all of these, many of which are actually small markets, which are heritage structures in the sense that they are at least like 80 or 90 years old, but they're mostly underutilized nowadays. So can these be made, for example, craft centers? Can these be made places where cultural events can happen? So, and it's not like, it's not something that has not been done before. If you, anybody, for example, in Ahmedabad, small chalks within market areas have actually been used to hold cultural events. So it's something that's perfectly doable if only we had a little bit of support from the government. So of course, in addition to these unorthodox public spaces within the city, which can work as cultural venues, there are also spaces within the city which are actually meant for cultural venues, but which are not being used. So for example, the bandstands come to mind. Or even the town hall, which in Bangalore was actually meant to be a place where cultural events were held, but that is not really something that is accessible to all anymore. And a third kind of place in Bangalore, which is inaccessible, particularly in our city, are the archaeological monuments. So if you see in Delhi, for example, places like India Gate obviously are places where people are very close to people's hearts. That's not the case in the city because some of our monuments are inaccessible, like the Bangalore Fort and the Tipu Palace. But I will just end with the example of Begur Fort. So, which is also, it's, any of you have been there on a Saturday morning or any other day when you go there, it's really, really heartening to see how you can meet cowherds there. You can also meet people from the neighboring apartments there. Edgar, when you spoke about inclusivity, Begur Fort to me really encapsulates that because it's this large public space which has a lot of potential for all kinds of other events to be held there. It is completely open, inclusive, and accessible to all. So I really wish we could, if we look, what I'm trying to say is there are these spaces within the city which need a little bit of imagination to make them accessible and usable as cultural spaces for all. I'll stop with that for now.
Yeah, thank you, Meera. I think you've struck a chord, an important one, about accessibility, and comfort levels about, vis-a-vis monuments. And there are very few monuments that you can walk into, and one has to wait for either INTACH or some other group of people who do these walks to be able to access these, whether it's in Bangalore or in Mysore or Somnathpur or wherever. It's always something that requires, I think, a group more often than not. So I think it might be a really good idea that one starts to make a small sort of map of these areas that have the potential to engage with not just with tourists. I mean, I think with the citizens themselves, the citizens ourselves, to be able to discover these hidden gems, as I guess one would call them. Yeah. Now. Pushpa?
One second, let me just. Oh, oops, one second. Yeah, hi. I was very interested when you talked about architecture for all and archi-mania of the past. And right now we're in the age of bulldozers. So when you say architecture for all, in fact, large communities are being bulldozed out of existence. So that's something to talk about. And I also want to talk about the culture of protest as part of culture and to do with buildings. For example, I think I'll talk later about the Venkatappa Art Gallery, but in 2016, the Karnataka artists actually started a protest which went on for several months because the government at the time, I'm sorry, it was your government, Rajeev, they wanted to more or less privatize the heritage structures in Karnataka, which meant Halebeed, Belur, Badami, etc., and the Bangalore Archaeological Museum and the Venkatappa Art Gallery. Now, the Venkatappa Art Gallery itself came out because of artist protests, because they were pavement protests actually by artists in the 70s, because they said there is no place for us to exhibit. And the government should build a place which will house modern Karnataka art and have a space which people can rent cheaply. And people from all over Karnataka, artists from all over Karnataka could use the place for their activities. And so the Venkatappa Art Gallery was actually built in the 1970s, 74 or 75. And it was basically to house the works of Venkatappa, who left a large body of work to be housed in the government museum. Later on, it also has a large collection of modern Karnataka artists. K.K. Hebbar's large body of work is also there, which has been housed there, given by the family. So what happened in 2016 is, with this whole idea of the PPP, the government was had signed an MOU with the Tasveer Foundation for who would take over the entire space. And this is in prime land in the Kavan Park in the center of the city next to the Archaeological Museum, rebuild it and rename it and put away the collections, the existing collections, which are very valuable, which are the whole early history of Karnataka modern art, and fill it with their own collection of works. And that was going to be the Museum of Art and Photography, that is MAP. So after our protests, what happened was that MAP bought a different place right in front of Venkatappa Art Gallery, was bought for MAP, and the building is coming up now, which is fine. But very interesting, like the protests were very creative and interesting because it happened in different parts of Bangalore. So what has happened is that the town hall has become a very interesting protest space. So on the steps of town hall, there are a lot of protests, and then there were protests in Venkatappa Art Gallery itself, around the museums, Commercial Street, different parts of the Majestic. There were performances and actions, which artists were doing. And this was happening all over Karnataka. I think it was historical because artists from all over Karnataka were joining in the protest. This went on for about 6 months. And in fact, though the MOU was not cancelled, people advised Tasveer Foundation to drop the idea and go elsewhere. But another interesting thing is, 2 days ago, I went for a protest in Freedom Park. Freedom Park, of course, has been built by Saumitro, designed by Saumitro, and it's on the old central jail, which is a historic place. And many events happen there. But the organizers told us that now the police say you cannot have a protest anywhere else in Bangalore. All the usual streets, like, for example, the Gandhi statue or town hall or Majestic or Mysore Bank, and all those places where people have traditionally had protests, and you can have it. Sorry?
No, continue.
I got cut off. So you can only have it in Freedom Park. So, oops, sorry, something's happened.
Yeah.
What happened? Something like, okay. So, yeah. So maybe, I mean, I don't know what your provocation is, but I might continue with the WAG Forum protest, because we thought, we discussed many issues around cultural spaces and cultural buildings and the cultural commons. I'd like to, we'll use this word cultural commons, and who has a right to the cultural commons. So I'll wind up here.
Thank you, Pushpa. Yes, that was a very successful protest, I do recollect, where the WAG managed to stay autonomous and represent again, all artists of all persuasions, whether they were starting in life or retrospective of artists well into their seniority. But I'll come back to that later when I just ask certain questions or provocations regarding what I'm hearing. So I think Champaka is the last to present.
Thanks, Edgar. And yes, thank you very much. Thanks to the RV School of Architecture, Professor Bhavne, Edgar and Salila, particularly. I've known you both for very long, so it's wonderful to be here with this very distinguished panel. I do have a couple of slides, but I guess I'll share just some images to situate ourselves right at the outset, and then we could do away with these slides. So today I wish to share reflections, and perhaps I'm going to reinforce what some of my co-panelists have already spoken about. So today I wish to share reflections on two types of dynamics of public architecture, which claim democratic values in different cities across the world. And I'm going to speak about two specific types of architectural spaces. One is the Sacred Hearts Basilica in Paris, and the second, which is our own Karga festival, and many of you have spoken about this, but I'm going to address this particularly from the lens of democratic values. The Sacred Hearts Basilica in Paris tells a strange and tortured history, as David Harvey powerfully explains in his essay titled Monument and Myth. It's one of my most favorite essays on this, on architecture and its relationships to political movements. So while the Sacred Hearts Basilica is among the most popular tourist destinations in Paris, this is what we can see here on slide number 2. Its political significance is rarely known. Embedded in its invisible, majestic presence is a strife between monarchy and conservative Catholic institutions on the one hand, and people power on the other. In this environment of narrow nationalism in India today, the Sacred Hearts Basilica is crucial to reminisce just as much as is the Karga festival. The Sacred Hearts Basilica was initiated during the Franco-Prussian War, the war between France and Germany at that time. This was for a period of 1 year between 1870 and 71. At that time, France was ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte III. Unlike his predecessors, Napoleon III was the first emperor of Republic of France who was elected to the presidency. In 1851, when he could not be re-elected, he staged a coup. He took over France as the emperor, led the country to war, and lost against the Germans. So this period was known for his excesses and moral decadence, because he was really largely self-serving. The Sacred Hearts Basilica, which was initiated in 1871, just at the time when France lost out to Germany, is seen by many as his repentance for his self-indulgence at the cost of the people. Napoleon III was then exiled. To mark the peace, this moment of peace with Germany, a national assembly was formed in 1871 in France. In the same period, a second force, a religious one, was equally strong. This is the cult of the Sacred Heart, which drew its support from ultra-conservative Catholics that had been supportive of the monarchist regime. Given this claim to power by monarchists and religious institutions, Republican Parisians were afraid that this newly formed National Assembly would reinstate monarchy. So to prevent such a moment, on March 18th, 1871, revolutionaries took over Paris. They held municipal elections to claim a people-led democratic regime in Paris, and that also means to the rest of France. But alas, their organizational capacities were weak. These insurrectionists were mercilessly killed, and this is what you can see on this particular slide here, where the first slide is the Sacred Heart. First image is on the left is the Sacred Heart Basilica. To the right is the image of all the communards that were mercilessly killed. And at the heart of this particular war, the civil war, was the site of the Sacred Heart Basilica. which the communards occupied. And this particular story is really, the story is so close to my heart because it really is torturous and tumultuous, as David Harvey puts it. It's really a story of how architecture can become representative of these tensions between power structures like the monarchy and religious, highly extra-conservative religious institutions, and people power on the other hand. It's really truly a symbol of democratic claims to cities through public architecture such as Sacred Heart's Basilica. Today, we are confronted in India with several examples that are sort of counterpoints to this or similar circumstances, I would say. We have no dearth of examples in public discourse today where public space and architecture is violently claimed by dominant groups and resisted by minority communities. I think Pushpamala highlighted many of these already. Social movements against the recent reduced imaginations of citizenship or incarceration of public intellectuals seeking responsible free speech are increasingly subjugated. What can we as architects do? What precedents can we garner in order to peacefully reclaim public space as architecture for all in the sense that the Sacred Heart's Basilica, for instance, represents? But we also have other examples in our own city. The beautiful Karaga festival is an interesting combination of gender sensitivity, Hindu mythology, and democratization of public space in the city. The event starts at Sampangi Tank, a historically important cultural space linked to water, fire, and the earth. For 11 days, a man dressed as Draupadi, who is mythologically the wife of 5 Pandavas in the Mahabharata, navigates streets, open spaces, traditional tanks. More importantly, the long energizing procession for about 11 days resurrects democratic claims to public space in a city where environmental resources are rapidly getting depleted, open spaces are becoming more and more gated, and shrines on the streets have become exclusionary spaces. And there are many scholars who've written about this. There's Smriti Srinivas, Janaki Iyer. They've all written about many of these dwindling sort of spaces of democratic claims, public spaces of democratic claims in Bangalore. Similar to the Karaga festival, an equally powerful parallel from Bangalore is the Infant Jesus congregation at the St. Mary's Basilica at Shivaji Nagar, where people from all religions gather. Now, this is a great symbol of tolerance. The problem is that as architects and designers, we have so far shied away from engaging with political strategy. And this is such a great forum here at the RV School of Architecture to actually be discussing this. So whether it's Karaga or the Infant Jesus Mass or the story of Sacred Heart's Basilica, we as architects need to do our bit to reclaim public architecture as democratic space. It's high time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Champaka. That was a very fascinating journey, actually, that you took us on from Montmartre in Paris right down to the lanes of Valepet and Tarupet and Sampangiram, the tank. It's interesting to look at how the church, with all its power and all its bullying of the monarchies at times asserted themselves. But 100 years later, I'm just noticing, you talked about 1871, and in 1968, there was another revolution of sorts. And interestingly, that was not a political revolution, it was a socio-cultural one, which I am thinking would actually have been the same in 1871. Partly political, but in 1968, it was entirely socio-cultural, because there was this patriarchy, and there was the students were being what's the word? It was just the administration going a bit berserk in Paris. So that thing over 100 years actually is an interesting trajectory. Another thing that's entering the discourse, which is interesting, is that it's taking on the colors of today, and the traumatic sometimes situations that lots of people have in the public domain, and they're not able to assert themselves. but that will come. We'll come to it in the next part of the. So all of you all having presented your positions or your reactions to this brief, I think it's taken on a much larger sort of dimension. It's not just architecture per se as a as a container, but I think the container is being burst forth, and we have to now reconstruct it to see how people can actually encounter perhaps a much more meaningful and a much more exciting sense of space. So I'll start with my first question or bleak provocation, and I'll go in the same sequence. Bijoy, I'm calling this architecture as being a public art. We talk so much about architecture being a public art, but seldom, does it really engage with the public at large. Even in the West, it's a phenomena of what I just referred to, of the post-1968 events, when I think presidents and prime ministers began to realize that there's something brewing, there's something hotting up, there's something on the boil, and they have to look at perhaps culture as some sort of a glue to bring together the very disparate city. And you have that. We can't just say that we have it here in India. It's all over the world now. You look at Amsterdam. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, there are people who so-called belong. There are people who visit. There are refugees. There are immigrants. So the whole, sort of fabric of a city has changed over so many years. So, Bijoy, when I look at the building that you showed us, the BIC, I look at three important aspects here that actually make it what it is. Of course, to start with, it's sort of people-centric architecture. The second, I think, which is really important, and I think Pushpa maybe mentioned it in the context of Rajeev, is that liberal patronage. And the third is diverse and creative programming. Now, for this really to happen, it's happened in the BIC, but do you think, Bijoy, that this can actually become a blueprint for, or should an architectural brief contain things like programming stitched into it, so that when a building comes to life, then it knows exactly how it's going to behave, if I may put it. Bijoy?
Incredible presentations, very, very provocative. Thank you. I've been in Kerala for 4 days now, traveling through the state, looking at architecture for the IIA State Awards. And there is a renaissance afoot here in Kerala, reporting from the front, as they say. And really the thing that strikes me is that particularly in a place like Calicut, that there is of course, patronage from the government. So in fact, the local MLA who's been, he's not the MLA anymore, but he was here for 3 terms, that the local IIA chapter working with the MLA has transformed some 20 different public buildings for, returning them to sort of active public use. And your question about what makes them successful, what programming, etc. There's a wonderful school here in Calicut that Brijesh Saijal and his wife, have produced. And it was a defunct government school. They had 20 kids studying in that school. It's a large, 3-acre site in the heart of Calicut. And with the MLA's assistance, they raised, around 10 crores, partly from the MP, the corpus that the MLAs have themselves, and they've completely rejuvenated the building. One is, of course, they've increased their capacity. They have 700 kids now in that school. They've made public programming essential to cross-subsidize the way the school is run. So there's a very large auditorium that has been built as part of that program, which is public access given out to the city for events. the stewardship of that school, taking care of it. In fact, we were there on site at 12 in the night after our site visits to see the school. And the MLA himself, the ex-MLA himself, came to see the building and was cleaning the mirrors and turning on the lights. And, you know, there was a real ownership of this building and what it was doing in the city. So like Champaka's provocation at the end of her presentation, that, you know, yes, on the one hand, as architects, we are waiting for the commission to arrive in a way at our office. But what I've seen here in Calicut is that it isn't really that kind of, you know, rather detached engagement with the city, that these architects here from the Calicut, you know, group have gone out there and proposed things for a very long time. And now suddenly, you know, a lot of things are sort of aligning for them. And they're able to engage with public work in a way that is meaningful for the city. And the city too now is engaging them with fees for work for the city, and not pro bono, appreciating, you know, the value that architects bring to the imagination of what these buildings can do. So yes, I think the BIC is a good example, primarily not so much for its architecture, but for two things. One is in the mechanics of how the money was raised to make that building through small, you know, donations from, I don't know, the least was, you know, they had 25, 30,000 rupees, people paying that, you know, small amount, to very large, you know, corpus funds from corporates. But more importantly, I think once something is built and handed over, the stewardship of these public buildings is incredibly essential. How one imagines it, how one uses it. And I think that's where the BIC has been really successful, even during the pandemic. So it shows that, you know, the building is in a way incidental, but it's the imagination of what that public forum needs to engage with and include in its programming that makes it a vital part of the city. So yeah, thanks.
Well, I appreciate that modesty there, but I have to say one thing about, you know, when one goes to the BIC, is that you really have a cross section of people. I mean, it's a building that is, I call it people centric, because people just walk up and they continue walking and they go to the terrace, and there is no meaning to it. They're just coming there because they either heard about it or they're interested, or it's a different sort of building and it's in a residential area and there's a nala there. And why is it there? In fact, I've asked some people, an auto rickshaw driver, for instance, so, you know, so he's asked me when I dropped me once, you know, what is this and why is it here? And they are all small houses, and, you know, so it has created a certain traction. And I think it is because it's inviting, you know. The only thing I have about that building is, you know, I'm wondering whether it came from the fear of clients, is, you know, if that could have been a threshold to the city, no gate, no fences, no nothing. It would have been, you know, I always enjoy going to Ranga Shankara because it's an extension of the pavement, you know, you just walk in. And wow, I can imagine in my own mind, you know, that happening one day. Anyway, Rajeev, I'd like to come to you on this on the topic of these you know, cultural spaces. You know, in recent times there have been very courageous attempts, you know, and initiatives to transform city neighborhoods, you know, for spaces for cultural encounter. I'm not talking about museums per se. The operative word really is encounter, you know. Ranga Shankara in JP Nagar, and then Jagruti in Marathali, NGMA of a different type in the cantonment. And of course, the one which has been talking about, the BIC. Except for the NGMA, all the other three are private initiatives, you know. Now, how does one take this format across the city, you know? Public funds, private-public partnership. Rajeev, can the government actually do more, whichever government, I mean, to recognize the need to wean away the public from what Kundera refers to as useless activities, formulate an imaginative cultural policy, you know, that I spoke of. For a population of around 10 million, I mean, we have an abysmally low number of cultural institutions. Now, I'd like to use the word institution because, of course, there are so many. I mean, that's the culture that we belong belong to, everything that's spontaneous and cyclic. But institutions, I think Pushpa will agree that there are just not enough galleries. I mean, there can be 10 times more galleries, 5 times more galleries in this city, and maybe 10 more BICs. But how does it come about? Rajeev, any ideas on this?
Well, I mean, I'd like to pick up on two words that Bijoy used: stewardship and imagination, right? So when you think about a lot of the cultural spaces, even our parks, the site for protest, these are all, the imagination is that these need to be tightly controlled, that access needs to be restricted, and so in the process, a lot of our a lot of the possibilities are lost. Right. And so that's where we probably need to have these sorts of conversations, engage with the powers that be, and try to change their imagination to something which is more liberating. Now, liberating in the sense of saying, let a 1,000 flowers bloom or something like that. But the point here is that there is one thing where the government is very, very critically required for. And that is, a lot of these spaces require land, require, repurposing of existing, facilities, things like that. And or accessing. I mean, so for example, when you talk about reviving a Kalyani in Hebar, right, next to the lake, there's a whole beautiful what would you call it? A step well, right? That has been, sort of revived. Now, this is something that could become a space for a variety of cultural activities if you can figure out a way to make that happen. So, along those lines, my sense is that so we need to keep generating these ideas. We need to engage with the government in terms of asking for opportunities to do more of these, just like Chitra Sante is one. And then when you talked about cyclic and periodic events like the festivals, see, one of the things is that nobody sits down and puts down a calendar. If you actually buy the Bangalore press calendar, you will see that, it will tell you that on this day, you have the Kadlekai Parishe. On this day, you have something that, ahead of the year, this is actually already known. And what we don't do is turn it into a cultural attraction and highlight it in the media or in such a way that both natives and citizens who are living here and also people who are passing through find this, something that's worth attending and, and partaking of, right? And so this is as far as the traditional cycle of festivals of various kinds across religions, those sorts of things. The authorities tend to be most worried about, processions, about protests, about each one of these things, because there's, fear of disorder. And, but I think the whole mindset can be changed to celebration of talent and culture and things like that. So, so that's there. But I mean, when we talk about protest, I personally find that, locating protest only at Freedom Park really misses the point, because the idea of protest is to let people know that this, that somebody is objecting to something, right? So when we do something at Town Hall, at least, it's visible, on that main artery, both JC Road and from City Market, there's quite a lot of visibility. That same used to be the case with Mahatma Gandhi statue, or the Gopal Gowda circle opposite Vidhan Sabha, where the powers that be would visibly see that someone was objecting to something else. And now it's all sequestered in this corner, and there's this huge problem of not being allowed to protest. In 2009, when the Ramsena attacked women in a pub in Bangalore, I organized protests across Bangalore city, but by in a very decentralized, simultaneous manner. All right, and we didn't ultimately have what shall we say, approval. We just did it. But I was very, very worried about, police action. Nothing as dramatic as what Champaka showed us in Paris. But of course, nobody wants even the slightest lathi charge. And the idea is that you want to express yourselves. And, nowadays, you even have the government clamping down 144, you can't protest. I mean, all sorts of things like that, when most protests are substantially peaceful. And so, we just have to find ways, but I would also, along with monuments that are, Meera talked about, monuments that are inaccessible. I think the existing nature, right? When they revive an Agara lake, then there's enough space there for creating spaces for cultural activity. Okay, you can make them school celebrations, you can make them music concerts, and you do have these in certain ways. Rajyotsava celebrations, you will have concerts, organized by local communities across the city. So, but a lot of people don't engage with it because that happens to be native, and in Kannada perhaps, right? So, but all of these can be made accessible. I mean, I remember once visiting Sevilla, and in the middle of the night, there were all these actually religious processions, but the whole experience of being in the old city and, seeing the place just come alive with so much heritage and music and culture and art all thrown in was just, very, very memorable. I think there's so much potential there. I think this dialogue needs to continue. We need to do a brainstorming on an even more extensive basis, try and crystallize this into, here are the kinds of activities that can be undertaken. We used to have a Bengaluru Habba for a while, but that was a private-public partnership in some ways, but that, got sidelined. But there are numerous Bengaluru Habbas on the ground that are possible. And I think this is a good start to keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Rajeev. I think it's an interesting thing you brought up about the Freedom Park. At the time when it was an architect's competition, was a very interesting brief, actually to transform, to what do you call it, a prison into an open space, a park. And we all knew that, of course, it would take on that dimension, of protest. But then there were other aspects of the park that needed to also be in place. But I think there were harebrained ideas from the politicians. The mayor wanted the highest building in the world, tallest building in the world. Somebody wanted to put 4,000 cars underneath it. And then it sort of started to get a little diluted. I'm sure Soumitra must have had a real difficult time in trying to get this whole thing sort of built. So I have not been to the park for long, but I'm just wondering that, other than the protest, has that park done enough for the neighborhood? Because I know in that whole area, that was one of the very few open spaces on that scale. And I have to now make a trip there, probably on the weekend, and see what really is at Freedom Park. Thank you, Rajeev. Meera, we have actually fared rather poorly, in creating a sort of adaptive reuse for heritage buildings. And I'm stressing buildings, of course, but I know that heritage has to do with so much else. Architects have usually caved in, under pressure and under the market forces. Elgin flour mills, standard bricks and potteries, and numerous textile mills, Binny's, Minerva, on the one on Sampige Road. I mean, I think it's a long list of lost opportunities. While a global patron came along to save the Opera Theatre, the empire is being lost as we speak. And just for my friends tuning in from abroad, if they are, that's the Empire Film Theatre on MG Road. Walking to Koshi's one day, I imagined the colonnaded India garage, which was something from my childhood. I used to walk past it every day to school when I was a day scholar, not when I was a boarder. I imagine it's still standing. And I thought, why couldn't the new development embrace it? Is it a romantic notion? Definitely not. So, yeah, although heritage, I know, like I've said in the beginning, is about much more. Could you actually shed some light on this predicament, Bangalore? For instance, now Bijoy talked about architects taking the lead and actually going like activists into the city and identifying places where they could work on projects that maybe fructify 10 years or 5 years later. Now, I'm wondering, if younger architects are listening in, whether there is a scope, is there a possibility for something like this in Bangalore? Meera?
Okay. Let me first begin by reacting also to something Bijoy said, which also ties in with something you said, Edgar. So Bijoy, you spoke about a school, a government school, which has been made into a public space in Kerala. When we restored the Fort High School, one of the really wonderful things about that place, about that building, was how a set of 3 rooms on the ground floor, we discovered actually the walls that were between the rooms were actually temporary and had been recently put in. When we removed that, it's this really lovely, large auditorium, which has a great character. So we spoke to people in the government asking if this could in fact be used for cultural events, since anyway in the evenings the school is not used. So could it be something that could be used? And it could be a win-win situation because the school would get money for its maintenance. But that didn't work out for various government reasons, which I really don't understand, but there wasn't any support from the government, and I wish there would be. So Fort High School is one school, but there are so many other such government schools and other government buildings which could actually be adapted for purposes like this. So Janta Bazaar, another thing we had suggested, again, there's a lot of open area behind that building. There's again a lot of potential for that space to be used as a cultural space there. But of course, that also fell on deaf ears. But we do have hopes that at least a few of the other government areas, including some of the buildings we're restoring currently, we're working on these 4 very small railway stations. And we've been talking about it to various people, architects, including Bijoy and others, to see if there is something that can be done in those buildings, which can be of use to the community that lives immediately around them, as well as to the city. So we'll see how that goes. So this is all when it comes to government buildings. And I have to say, it's not like, there's resistance every step of the way. But when it comes to private buildings, there's resistance there as well, because, I really wish we could transform some buildings, like you mentioned, Edgar, India Garage or other such buildings. But we need liberal patronage of the kind that maybe BIC got, maybe something like that. If it came to a public or to a private building, maybe that would work. Otherwise, it's really just, it's very, very difficult without the money. That's really the bottom line.
Yeah, I can imagine the gravity.
Also, yeah, just one other thing, since Rajeev mentioned lakes and spaces, this background that you can see behind me, this is actually the sluice gates at Kempambudi Kere, and it's a very fond hope that these will also be restored. And again, this is an idea that we are pursuing with the BDA to see if this can be restored and again be used for public events, for plays put up by musical events put up by people around Gavipuram, whatever. School children could use it for their functions. So many possibilities are there, but it needs to be restored first. So this is something we're trying very hard to get done as well.
I think the real operative word is adaptive reuse, and how can we also have multiple uses? And that's very interesting what you said, because the Fort High School, which is so beautifully done. And I think it opened with a concert, if I remember. Was it a vocal, or was it? I can't recollect. I was not there, but I saw it. I saw a clip of it, and it was absolutely, exhilarating. Actually, that.
Yeah, it was.
So, Pushpa.
Yeah. Sorry.
Are you there?
Yeah, coming.
All right.
Oh, sorry. What am I doing? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, recently, about six weeks ago, I was in Dubai, and I went, of course, for the expo. And I came back sort of bruised and broken because I walked so much. But anyway, I experienced this Dutch pavilion, which was an eye-opener, you know, I mean, especially for an architect, because it was non-architecture. Of course, the thing was the theme was sustainability for this expo. So it was a nondescript assembly of rejected or hired out industrial, what do you call it, corrugated steel panels. They just put together to get a big volume. But what was absolutely incredible was the ideas that were contained within. You know, I mean, the theme was, because it was sustainable, it was water, food, energy. Now, it all carried out with in such a dramatic fashion, you know. Of course, first of all, it was ephemeral, and I'll come to the ephemeral part of it. I mean, your thing is permanent versus ephemeral. They actually sort of... Pardon?
Is that the provocative question?
Yes.
Okay.
The question comes after a little. So now they had a cone-shaped vertical farming. They had actual, sort of umbrellas with rain, etc., etc. Now, what I'm trying to get at is, you were amongst, like you said. So I'm bringing this ephemeral thing into it. Amongst many who saved the Venkatappa Gallery from losing its tag, you know, as the art space for all artists. But I asked myself, you know, there's such a wonderful opportunity around that building that can become, again, a cyclical sort of events. For instance, now, I don't want to give, well, sometimes examples only come from outside. The Serpentine Gallery has this, every year it has this pavilion that is dismantled after about 2 months. But it creates a resonance. And I don't think there's a better location for creating an architectural and an art shift in people's minds than that particular location. That water body could actually be used in a sense that, almost levitate pavilions over that water body. Now, having saved it, what happens now? Isn't Bangalore, with its 10 million people, deserving of a biennale, deserving of an architectural triennale, deserving of another gallery, deserving of something that's, you know, participative for all people?
I don't know what you want me to say about that, because all these
things... No, I want to say why it's almost stagnant now, in a sense. Nothing is happening.
No, I'll tell you how these things start. For example, I know exactly how the Kochi Biennale started. It was to do with the minister baby, who, what's his name? What's his full name? I forget. He was the tourism minister in the CPM government. And he actually, I think, invited Bose and Riaz to start the Biennale. He invited them. And it's mainly funded by the tourism. Now, all culture comes under tourism, by the way. So basically, all culture is supported, which can make money. So, in fact, biennales all over the world are, of course, tourist attractions. And they, like, for example, the Venice Biennale, like basically and that has many biennales of every possible subject, you know, of field. They all support the economy of Venice, which has no economy otherwise. It's only tourism, like, you know, it's just this kind of strange place which survives on tourism, and so does Kerala. I don't know. I'm sort of like, yeah, it can, but we do so many things over here, like, you know, and on so many different platforms. So, see, the Kochi had no art scene, hardly any art scene at all, I would say. It had some things. It was basically imported and put in there, which some people also objected to. So I completely support the Kochi Biennale, and it's a fantastic sort of, and fantastic hard work by Bose and Riaz, who are both friends of all of us. But I don't know, like, it's not as easy as a film festival. Like, you can have film festivals, like every village and city in Italy apparently has a film festival, an international film festival. because it doesn't cost so much. Art Biennale costs a lot of money, like transportation, insurance, and all that sort of thing is very, very expensive. So I don't know, like the other day I was at Chitrakala Parishad and Bose had come for this function. And of course, nobody over here in any place is interested in anything that we do. But the minute somebody comes in from outside, they are heroes and legends. And they were inviting Bose to start a Biennale here. So which is very strange for me. But art is not only about, there has to be consistent activity and lots of things going on. And I think certain places most places have become very inimical. They're not interested in anything to do with either any intellectual activity or culture at all. They're anti that. An earlier generation of politicians maybe might have read books. They were all writers as well. Not only did they read. So the writers at least had a major status in the state, in Karnataka, for instance, and in other states as well, because they're linguistic states as well, But they would also be sort of tolerant or interested in art or theater or film and so on and so forth. Architecture nobody knows about, by the way. So when people talk about architectural spaces and buildings, I think architectures, nobody knows about the field of architecture. By nobody, I mean the majority of the people, Edgar, and all of you over here, they know contractors and they know builders, and most people use them. So if you notice, if there's any inauguration of a building, nobody talks about the architect. Who is the architect of the building? In fact, I didn't know who the architect of BIC was. So I don't know whether, it's actually known, this whole notion of architecture is known at all, and it's not mentioned by the government anywhere as well. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to only think in big terms, that things have to happen all the time. And as far as the art scene goes, there are many, many excellent artists in Bangalore, but there is not much patronage over here. So we make it a point. I mean, I insist on doing things here and having shows here because I live here and I want to do it, But there's no reason for me to actually. I need not show here at all or do anything over here, and I can be perfectly I can lead my life. And several people do. So everything is not in terms of festivals, though I'm not against them as well. I was the curator of, for example, I was the curator of the Chennai Biennale in 2019, which a group of few friends have just started on their own, they with no government help, and that is a boon actually, because they'll drive you crazy with the bureaucracy. Just to get permissions, I know how difficult it was, because we had exhibitions in magnificent public buildings, all colonial public buildings in Madras, which were unknown to the public actually. We opened them up and had huge shows in 7 different locations and so on. And I know what I'm closely involved with that, and I know what a huge thing it is. And unfortunately, after that, the next Biennale, the Photo Biennale, was during the COVID, and they somehow had this kind of hybrid Biennale. And hopefully next 2 years later, they will have another proper physical Biennale. See, one thing is that Fort Kochi is a very small place, small town. Bangalore is a crazy city, difficult to get around. So one has to really think about, the city festival and what you have to do and so on. And of course, there is a film festival here, Bangalore Film Festival. Again, it's not as charming as it would be in a small town, for instance, So when you go to Goa for the International Film Festival, it's a different experience because everyone's like a community, and the whole film community turns up there and all that. So maybe one should not only think about Bangalore in terms of festivals, Smaller places like perhaps Mysore might be a better place. Better kind of spaces and easier to get around and so on.
No, I think my use of the word Biennale sort of put you on a different track, because I'm not talking about big terms. In fact, I'm talking about, you saved the Venkata Art Gallery. Yeah. What are we doing, not you, what are we doing to revitalize it, to reimagine a new life for it. And the fact that you said that nobody knows about architecture, isn't that the most obvious place to set up this cyclic sort of pavilion that contains art, contains whatever information? It can be information of the city, it can be a tourist center, but it is there for maybe 2 or 3 months of the year, or 2 months.
That's a fantastic idea. Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. In fact, these are some of the ideas we thought about, Edgar. We had very interesting projects like World Cafe and so on, and we presented it to the government, and I mean, nothing has been done, or for several years. So since it's a government building, it's also very difficult to. But otherwise, like for years, we've had so many festivals and so many events over international events like the Code Workshop, International Live Art Festival. Lots of them. They're very, very active. In fact, even after. Pardon?
There's no buzz, it's not.
No, buzz cannot be only by a few people, so why don't you start doing things there? In fact, we had so many interesting ideas, like the terrace can be used and for it has to be also revived. I heard a rumor the other day that this government is trying to do something, but nobody knows about it. I just rang up one friend of mine who's actually close to the BJP, and he also didn't know about it. So I've asked him to find out what is happening. No, it is a government institution. You can't just go there and take over.
Rajeev, do you want to say very briefly something on this? Because the word government has come in so often. So, okay, then I'll go to Champaka.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, Champaka, with your your wonderful presentation of the Montmartre church, I thought maybe it would be nice to stick to France and Paris. And there was this great Mitterrand wave in Paris. It was, I think, after the 1968 student movement, that a whole lot of grand projects started to come up in the city. And what I liked about that idea was it was on a particular scale, a revitalization sort of project, because they've also had a lot of problems with the students. And the first time, I think, in France, with the students and workers united to battle the establishment. I think 10 projects, 12 projects dotted all over the city. Now, as a sort of planning strategist, I mean, what does one learn from that? I mean, I know that these are very large, big plans, and they can't just be sort of overlaid on any other city. But is there in a master plan of a city that culture becomes an absolute important thing? So neighborhoods start to get regenerated, revived, revitalized through these spaces, Actually, some of these neighborhoods have had these Sangeet Sabhas and things, but they were more elitist. I'm looking at something that people just walk into, like Ranga Shankara, Is there something that we take from the Mitterrand age?
I'm sure, Edgar, since I do have some experience of having worked in France and in a French firm, I think I should be able to evoke some examples from different cities in France and the kinds of policy instruments they actually use to, bring together people. And there's a participatory as well as negotiative sort of a process. And it's also public-private partnerships. I'm not against the instrument per se. I think the problem is with the perverse manifestations of some of these instruments. And that, of course, is dependent on context. But I do know in Canada, for instance, PPPs, the availability, for instance, is used very successfully. And similarly, in France also, they have a particular tool, for instance, it's called the ZAC, which is more like the town planning scheme in the Indian context. And I'm going to speak a little bit about this because we deployed this particular tool in the master plan for Bangalore when I was working on this in 2003. And we called it the coordinated planning scheme. We situated the use of this tool within the provisions for the town planning scheme in the Karnataka Town and Country Planning Act 1961. Now, what happened to that tool? What we suggested is to reimagine a lot of these mills which were dying out. We had the Rajkumar mills, which has now become Mantri Mall and Binny Mills, Minerva Mills. We've actually reimagined these spaces as spaces of cultural activities, a mix of different kinds of activities. And the premise was that you need to look at bringing together a whole host of public functions in these spaces rather than follow the Mumbai model of converting mills to malls. We said we need to actually look at all of this public architecture. And so the mechanism design here is from a law and policy point of view is to pool land, to bring together a whole host of institutions, whether public, private, civil society, and a range of other cultural actors, etc., to bring them all together to pool land through the TP scheme mechanism and make it much more equitable in terms of how land goes back to a lot of the people around these large parcels of land. And there's collective imagination of what these spaces could have actually become for the city. But what the BDA actually did in the finalization of the plan is they converted all of these CP scheme zones that we had demarcated into commercial land use. And they did use the CP scheme, although in a sort of a strange way, because they demarcated land parcels along the arterials and the ring roads, at the intersections of these arterials and ring roads. They demarcated these land parcels as CP scheme to facilitate ease of future acquisition of land by the BDA in the future. So the sole purpose of imagining revitalization or renewal of urban places in the city, and I'm speaking about places from an urban design, cultural geography perspective here. That whole purpose got defeated when we actually tried to sort of bridge these knowledge spaces that exist. But I also wanted to sort of respond, if I have a couple minutes more, to another set of aspects that many of our panelists have spoken about in terms of finance. And I think this is an opportunity again for me to underscore the models that are used not only in cities in the global north, but also in the south. There's Johannesburg, there's the government of Indonesia, for instance, is institutionalizing the capital investment planning mechanism. The JNNURM scheme did try to institutionalize a CIP sort of a mechanism so that there's transparency in the kinds of projects that are actually conceptualized for the city. And these become part of a CIP mechanism where at the elected representatives are involved with respective communities at the ward level, at the city level, as well as at the state level, because planning in India is still a state function and for most state governments in India. So the CIP mechanism, I've been highlighting and underscoring the importance of institutionalizing this mechanism. And I do hope there's some time when we actually get on with it. It allows for multiple, it's a negotiative sort of a space again, where multiple departments at the state, so it could be cultural culture and heritage related departments, as well as corresponding institutions at the city government level, public, private, various organizations, they actually come together. And in Johannesburg, for instance, they're up for 3 entire nights negotiating and debating, because it's the time when you claim stakes to money. So it's a very tumultuous process there. Again, it's not an easy process. And I've heard about this from people who are involved in this process. And so what gets done in the CIP process is basically a demand-led listing of projects is done. And then the municipal corporation, as well as other funding agencies, take stock of what is the budget available for all of these projects. Obviously, in our context and many other cities in the global south, there's deficits. So then they take stock of what the budget fit is. There's a prioritization process, which is also a politically led process. And then there's political stewardship, and I'm going back to Bijoy's emphasis on stewardship, as well as Rajeev's emphasis on custodianship. So that needs to be with the municipal corporation, because they are the corporators we elect, and so the budget fit is done through then prioritization, which is and then these budgetary allocations are made, and then alternative modes of finance are discussed. It could be through public-private partnerships. In some cases, there are a whole range of iterations of that model. but it could be through crowdsourcing. Kerala has experimented with that. There's just so many different models today that are there for financing public spaces and public infrastructure. So I think all of that needs to get institutionalized in our city. So whether it's CIP that's used not just in France, but in many other cities in the global south, or it's the ZAC, I think it's high time that we actually start making these efforts to bring all of this up through a demand-led bottom-up process. And that is happening. It's not that it's not happening. There's an enormous amount of efforts. Janagraha, for instance, is working quite intensely in the space. A whole host of other political parties who are also working at the grassroots level. They're working on strengthening local, local ethos for taking up more bottom-up led spaces of kind of public architecture.
To ask each other a question, but I'd rather that I throw it open to the audience. There is a sort of audience of almost 40. So there have been 3 questions that have come in. Madhuri, can you navigate that?
Yes, Edgar. I think Meghla wants to ask a question. Meghla?
Yeah, hi, good evening, all. Firstly, would like to thank all the panelists for having brought so many different perspectives. I think this whole idea of architecture for all just got more complex with so many entities informing it. But one thing which got clearer over these conversations was the fact that if you're looking at it as architecture and all as the people who we're serving to. But my question would be, having identified that what molds architecture for the architecture of public spaces or the design for all, one, if you're looking at people themselves taking control of how the spaces should be and what they need, people could surprise us the way they use public spaces. And then designers who are going to be moderating the needs and the experiential aspect of the spaces, and then the authorities who can actually fund and ensure that we can actually actualize these projects. So does this bring us to a point wherein we need an organized framework and a process where all of them could be represented in a certain way and take this whole process through to actualize them? But the flip side to this could be, would it get too bureaucratic at a point of time? In that case, then how do we moderate that? That was one part of the question. And another question that I have is, if we're looking at design and architecture for all, how strong should the architecture be as an identity and as a facilitator if we're looking at giving back power to people to be able to have a certain level of freedom, and which brings us to the aspects of accessibility and inclusivity. So should architecture start becoming more of a backdrop which can facilitate the use of spaces, public spaces? Yeah, thanks.
Anybody wants to take that? I mean, are you sort of directing that question to somebody in particular of the panel?
Not anybody in particular. I want to know the response.
No, I'll just very briefly say that, I think it came out in the beginning, that architecture and a project is about 3 things. Like we took BIC as a particular sort of blueprint. That one, you have an people-centric building, an imaginative architecture. Then you have a very liberal, patronage. And third is that you have very creative and diverse sort of programming. So I think what happens is that when people start to inhabit the space, they must feel that the space belongs to them. I mean, I don't think in any political sort of level, but I think it speaks to them spatially and as well as the content. Now, if you look at the programs at the BIC, we're just taking that as an example, they go across the whole spectrum. I mentioned folk, then from folk to to classical, to experimental, So I think this thing about each one finding their particular comfort niche with part of the programs. And there are people who want to experience it all. I mean, there are people who go to the BIC every week. So I am not very sure about, are you coming from a standpoint of a group of people go to an architect or to something and want their particular things to be addressed? Or are you looking at architecture that is able to absorb the aspirations of the people for whom it is to serve? So this is a little sort of yin and yang there. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but somebody else maybe can try.
Can I respond, Edgar?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, loudly. Quite clearly.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, the first question, in fact, is a provocation that reminded me of, I don't know if you know this Spanish architectural firm called Spatial Agency. I don't know if you heard of them, but they're like guerrilla architects, So what they spoke at the first Z-Axis conference, that Rudraj had curated, and it is. I mean, the point of it, I think, for me, at least from this exercise in Kerala, is that we aren't waiting for anyone. And that's what the spatial agency example is, that they're, of course, taking it to the extreme, the logical conclusion of that kind of activism where they inhabit illegally, in some sense, public buildings that they say are public. And so why aren't they open to us? For instance, in Bangalore, there's NGF, which is waiting for someone to reimagine, not someone, but maybe a community of artists or something, Public land lying unused and inaccessible, which is kind of strange. Champaka listed a whole bunch of them as part of, what was initially in the plan, Minerva, Binny Mill, some of them taken over by the government, part of, what happens to these public lands that are now defunct and unused, and who has access to them, and why don't we have access to them? And so the extreme case would be to do the spatial agency, which is to just go there and start living there, have your office, and it's public land, and so here we are. But I think what Professor Gowda also said, this idea of imagination, I mean, really, I don't know what it takes. It's easy to talk about these things, but there are so many moving parts and so many constituents, so many stakeholders, as they call them in the city. How do all of these voices come to bear on public policy? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Professor Gowda can talk about that to some extent. But how does that, and that's really your question, like how does that then become a framework that is loose enough that allows imagination, allows appropriation, and yet not too loose to become anarchic, that it is difficult to manage, or, I don't know, maybe I'm not clear about it, but so these two extents, the other thing that I wanted to just talk about a little bit is also in the architecture, and I wanted to talk about, Mr. Correa a bit, that in the architecture itself, if you're talking about architecture and the way that architecture sort of allows, or not allows, but enhances the quality of being public. And I just want to talk a little bit about the Kala Academy in Goa and the way in which that section works to make the building seem like it belongs to everyone. The access to the river, the dropping down of the building in a way that then allows you, access. But all of this requires imagination and stewardship. I mean, the Kala Academy is now it's behind a barricade. It's being reimagined, God knows how. And it is completely obfuscated from public view. This building, which, the architect has so beautifully designed, will soon, well, hopefully not, but may soon be some other kind of, building, which then, has compromised that public nature of the building. So I think essential, I mean, architecture, of course, some architects, they do great buildings, but a lot of it then depends on how it then is taken care of and sort of, taken forward. So the idea of all of these public lands in the city, I think at RV and at BMS, we're looking at this constantly through all of our studios because they're waiting for new imagination and new life. What a great opportunity for the city, and how come nothing's happened and they're all malls now, they're all commercial, strange commercial projects, which, and also just a comment about the city, Professor Gowda mentioned the UB city. I think there is a fundamental sort of problem with regards to places like the UB City or Hudson Yards in New York, which are privately developed commercial projects, because of course you're allowed access, but that's contingent on the developer, right? I mean, they could decide, or she could decide that no access today, sorry, I mean, it isn't public. I mean, it is public in a very sort of loose sense of that term. But it is at a fundamental level, not really for everyone. And there is that notion that it could be controlled and curtailed. So they are compromised in that sense as public space in the city. And I don't know whether the mall is really the way that one imagines public space in the future.
I think one of the things that happens is that whenever there's a place where people gather, somehow this very quickly some kind of censorship comes into play and that place is destroyed. And that also happens in like so many institutions, like the canteen is always the heart of something, FTI canteen, famous, notorious, whatever. They move the canteen somewhere else. Like in the 70s and 80s, for instance, whenever I used to come to Bangalore, I used to see that all the writers, like especially the Navya writers and theatre people, used to gather at Ravindra Kalakshetra. And on the side, there's one booth, which used to have puff and tea. So everyone would gather there, sit on the steps and have this vegetable puff and tea. And then after that, go to the press club to have a drink. And every day they would gather. So if you went over there, anytime you were visiting Bangalore or you wanted to hang out with these guys, I used to meet all, Anant Murthy, Karant, the whole lot, like, Ramachandran Sharma, everybody, like, was hanging around on the steps and then sometimes go along with them to Mobos or Press Club, which used to be Addas. So they're like Addas, And also what happened was that the Lalit Kala Academy, it had a building which it now has called Kannada Academy when nothing happens. I mean, there's an auditorium where sometimes things happen, but it used to have a graphic workshop in one of the rooms of Ravindra Kalakshetra. And that became an adda for all the artists to gather, So they're just two kind of presses. And for several years it ran, and one of our friends, Jaikumar, was running it. So in the evenings, people would just go there and make prints, and the other people who were were not working there would just go and meet them there. And after that, we would go somewhere. That again, like after some years, for no proper, in fact, I myself have gone there and worked in the early 90s. But after that, it was just closed. And then we asked people, where are those machines, And apparently there's near Kalagrama, it's been moved because there's supposed to be a kind of artist village which is supposed to come up there, but nothing has happened. And let me tell you, like for all the governments, I think culture is the last, option, or they're simply not interested in anything intellectual, as I also meant, except for political reasons when, you can take over some institution or, destroy something. I don't think the powers that be are interested at all. And that also holds for the general sort of public, at all in any form of cultural activity on the whole.
That, of course, shouldn't diminish our
interest. That's very, very difficult for us to survive in. Sorry?
No, I said that should not diminish our collective interest. But I just want to stop.
No, we are interested. We keep on working, but I'm telling you, it's very depressing.
No, I know. I mean, we worked in this city for 40 odd years. I know how it works.
Yeah.
There's one more question to come in. That's why I just Madhuri, that's why I had to butt in.
Yes, Edgar. Jagriti, would you like to ask?
How many more are there? How many more questions?
I think one more after this.
Okay.
Jagriti, can you hear me?
Ask them to sort of, point out to who they are addressing the question so that we save time. Because it's past 8,
hello.
so.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Jagriti, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, hi, I'm Jagriti. I'm a faculty at RVCA. So very interesting narratives on the entire idea of culture and heritage put forth by the panelists, which leads me to a kind of postulation as whether the idea of mapping heritage for the purpose of conservation, say, is still to a large extent non-inclusive, very slowly evolving from the it's stuck on the notion of only monuments or built structures as the primary outcome of such mapping exercises, while smaller informal spaces which actually lend the kinetic character to the cities, they fail to be mapped, as cultural spaces. So the question is that why is it that when it comes to heritage structures per se, we talk about conservation, but when it comes to streets, chalks, neighborhoods, ma'am just talked about those small little booths, which becomes these addas. When we talk about such places that are vibrating with culture and heritage, we almost always talk about redevelopment as the approach. So yeah, that's what my question, or more of a postulation on this entire discussion is. It's not directed to a certain person, but if anyone would like to pitch in on it, it would be great.
Is Meera here?
Yeah.
Because it's
Thank you.
Meera?
Yeah. So, Jagrati, I think you're partly right, but only partly. So you're right that there is still this conception of when we speak about heritage, it being largely about built heritage, and there is definitely a bias towards monumental structures. There's no doubt about that, but I think that that's not. I think that's more like a common perception of what heritage is. But I think that that's actually, like, if you speak to other people in the field, I think that you would see that that's really that concept of what heritage is has changed. It's really only the administrators and the common people, and the common people who think of heritage as something that is monumental. So, for example, if you go to a bureaucrat and talk to them about Bangalore's heritage, they'll say, Bangalore, what heritage? You go to Mysore, because Mysore has got palaces and we don't. So there is that problem. But the second part of your comment was about about how we're only talking about redeveloping or revitalizing smaller structures, so non-monumental structures. So I think that again, I think is not quite true. In fact, like, one of the things that I was trying to say in my introductory remarks was that there are several smaller public spaces which are being used currently for various purposes, and they could very well be adapted for cultural uses, not necessarily revitalized or rebuilt or anything like that. The existing spaces could actually be used for other purposes, including cultural events, primarily because they are far more accessible. People have been speaking about the UB city, and to me, it's like really strange how anyone can think of that as a public space, because it is so intimidating. For many people who are not from, for many people, it is an intimidating space. Whether or not it is private or public is not the issue. The ownership is not the issue. The space itself is very intimidating. Chances are most of those 10 million people will not be going there. Whereas if you look at a place like, a smaller space, which is within the neighborhood, those are intimate spaces. People are familiar with them, and they lend themselves to other uses if we can be a little imaginative about it. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but you also said something about how mapping of cultural spaces is not inclusive or something like that. I think you said something like that. That again is something I think that's changing, because there are initiatives, whether it is from INTACH or other organizations, other people who are actually taking a more inclusive approach to identifying what is heritage, which goes beyond monuments. So it goes beyond temples. It also includes things like cultural spaces, the chowk, the Ashwat Kattes. All of these are our heritage, and I think this is being recognized, perhaps not in a wider, not amongst a wider audience, but it's coming. It is there. The idea that culture goes beyond monuments is definitely there.
One more, no, Madhuri?
Yes, Edgar. I think Salila also had something. Salila? Anyone else from the audience?
We couldn't hear Salila, actually.
Yeah.
Is she there?
I think she's having some connectivity issues. Let me just get to her.
No, she's there. She was on mute. Yeah.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, my earphones are giving me some trouble. So anyway, I was just going to say thanks for an amazing, very rich and diverse set of observations and comments and provocations to all the speakers and Edgar. So I was just thinking, when you think about, so my takeaway from this would be, if an architect has to think about meaningful architecture for all, it's first of all, the idea of an all is kind of, everyone's talking about public so much, and is there a possibility of an all at all? Because the idea of multiple public seems to be more realistic than having a public or all, right? So then I just was wondering if, so my takeaway would be that if an architect had to think about public architecture, then would they have to think about who and what is public about that architecture then? And is that something the panelists would like to respond to?
Can I respond to that, Edgar?
Yeah.
I think that's a very important point that Salila brought up. And I think we all know that, the word liberal came up several times. And we all know that post-liberalization of the economy in India and elsewhere in the world as well, the number of actors and the types of actors involved in decision-making spaces has really got amplified, exploded. We also know that as opposed to the pre-liberalization period, when governments would actually execute many of these projects through a much more sort of a straightforward delegatory approach, national government schemes, would channelize monies, for example, the various infrastructure development schemes, monies would be channeled sort of in a much more linear way. That has changed dramatically as well because governments, public, private, civil society, all of them are interacting at a whole range of scales of decision making. And they're predictable to some extent, but they're not predictable otherwise. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty in this space. So I think the point Salila brought up is really important because who does all mean in this context of sort of amplified actors and unpredictability in terms of how they are, less predictability, let me put it that way. And I think here it's really important that all the kinds of initiatives that Meera spoke about, or even, whether they're biennales or other kinds of cultural revival sort of initiatives or projects that are taken up in the city, it's important that the entire ecosystem of participants are actually involved and they take custodianship of this process. Again, like stewardship, going back to what Bijoy was speaking about. And the point that I want to make is going beyond what everyone's shared about everyone needs to be part of this. But I think mere participation is not enough. We need to actually think about a myriad range of partnerships, small, big, and I think Pushpamala made a point as well that there are a whole range of small establishments which are involved in the space. So we need to be very creative as designers in imagining a whole range of partnership arrangements across public-public, public-private, private civil society, which are sustainable because many of these, and it's really difficult to forge partnerships because all of these actors we're talking about, the connotation of the all it's very heterogeneous. Everyone's got, most of these actors have divergent values and goals, and to actually build shared values and goals is one big challenge. And then how do you actually get them to work with one another? Partnerships collapse even before they take off. So it's a very tedious job ahead of us. And I think we need to go beyond participation to actually think about partnerships so that things really work. And strong institutions are when and contracts, whether they are social contracts or they're more formal contracts, they work, and I think the responsibility on us as professionals is enormous because we have to make it work for all by making sure that we're all in it together and have a sense of custodianship of all of this. Businesses as well, in fact, I was just reading the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has this whole host of toolkits on how businesses need to actually become much more responsible. I think we need to really start actively working towards that, working with one another to build public-private partnerships, if at all, stuff that works. Yeah, I'll stop over there. But Salila, I thought that was a great question.
I just want to add just one sentence. In one of my paragraphs, I'd ended by saying, yes, it's time for a new architectural language based on people, plurality, and participation. And I think I should add the word partnerships, so that actually brings people together. And I think we can't do it just in small groups. There has to be, a larger, sort of partnership amongst the citizens, amongst the people. So it's people, plurality, participation, and partnership. Important word. Thanks, Champaka. So
I think Bijoy wants to say something. Yeah.
Well, I'll be very quick. Edgar, do we have time?
Yes,
already
yes.
past 8.
Yeah.
The idea that I think answering directly as an architect working, and having trouble, even when we're doing projects for a private client for their house, this idea of partnership is kind of difficult to manifest even in those projects. So forget about the public projects, because the way that we are educated as architects, there is somehow embedded in this education the idea that somehow the architect will make the amazing sketch, and then that will become the great building. And in that, in that is the burden of the creative genius, on all of us, that we are somehow going to make amazing things out of thin air. And what the project at the BIC, and of course most of our projects, people coming out of college soon realizes that the work that we produce as architects depends on assimilation of all kinds of information, of organizing that information, of really listening and being part of a process with others. And working on public works, I mean, someone said that we're not having much traction with the government. What's been great about the Calicut group is the fact that they've been able to figure out ways in which to talk about the finances, what the work, how the work can manifest in reality, and not just in terms of design. So how do we make those conversations with our clients, with the people we work with, as architects? And we can't make those conversations unless we think beyond just the beautiful object, the white shining building on the hill. That there are so many things, mechanics of these buildings that we don't understand, given our training in schools, that we are somehow imagining that, like Corbusier, we'll make that amazing sketch, and then that's the way architecture is made. And unfortunately, it requires a lot many more people to come together to make something meaningful happen.
But Bijoy, I'd just like to come back to the BIC. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, hearing from the various, stakeholders, for want of any other word, I think the architect there was part of a larger group that brought in their expertise. For instance, I think you told me, and somebody else told me before you did, that Girish Karnad came in there one day and he found that the stage was completely inadequate. Now, yeah. I absolutely agree with you that, we are not trained to look at everything. So you need people who have spent their whole life on stage, to be able to say, hey, I think you will need to push it out by 10 feet. So that's the type of partnership, I think, at a very fundamental level, not at a political level. And I think that's great if it can happen. It doesn't always, so.
Yeah, but we were kicking and screaming the whole time. I mean, it's great in hindsight that it all worked out. But, every month I would talk to Suni and say, we need to get out of this project because it's not going anywhere. But it is, that you see it in looking back at it, you realize that all of it was worth it, because everybody is working towards in the best interest of the project. Yeah. Arundhati Nag, Mr. Karnad, MS Satyu visited. Of course, all of them said that the auditorium just doesn't work. And we said, no, it's fine. We've got standards to prove it. And then we changed it, because, and thank God, But thank you.
All right. So I think we've come to the end of this rather prolonged, interesting, fascinating sort of discussion. So are we winding up then? Madhuri, Salila?
Yeah, Edgar, I think just a few words and we're done. So, after this very stimulating dialogue, there is little else I can actually say than a very big thanks to Bijoy, Champaka, Pushpamala, Dr. Iyer, and Dr. Gowda for generously sharing their time and thoughts. Big thanks to Edgar, of course, for his vital role in kind of developing this whole panel discussion, putting it all together so beautifully and bringing us to this point. So thanks, Edgar, that was wonderful. Thanks to everyone at RVCA who helped us put the event together today. And finally, a big thanks to our audience who participated and attended and hopefully partnered with us in future discussions and actions on making more cultural spaces in the public domain work. So have a lovely evening and take care. Thanks.
I just want to say one thing. I want to thank all the panelists for so readily saying yes. And that was really a very warm-hearted sort of response that I got from all five. Rajeev, of course, was on the road all the time. He was very keen to be part of it. And well, then he finally came back to Bangalore and there he was. I think the rest of us are all in Bangalore. So yes, thank you for saying yes, because that at the start I said was why this panel was so diverse and so exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, one and all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavne.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Good
Bye.
evening.
Thank
Good
you.
night.